Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Everybody, we're here for chapter 1 of The Body Keeps the Score, Mind, Mind and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. I should actually probably put that in the little title thing. Hello, Amelia, how are you? So yeah, we're reading part 1. Well, we're not gonna read. So yeah, let me just break down real quick. So the first part, I read the prologue, but I'm not gonna read anymore because, as you see, this book is thick. We would never get through it. So I'm just gonna highlight things for y'all. Like I said, this book is a deep dive into trauma, understanding the science of it, how it imprints itself on our mind and then impacts our actions, right? So the main takeaway is that trauma is an internal wound with external effects, right? That's what chapter 1 is really about. The title is Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. So it's Bessel, the doctor, his journey into studying trauma. He was a doctor, a clinician already in 1978. And he kind of highlights his journey of trying to understand something that's happening with this man who was a veteran. And everybody, at the time, there was no resources about trauma, so they're trying to diagnose him based on his behavior, his erratic behavior, his violent behavior, his numbness, his like dissociation from the world around him. So they're trying to figure it out, but because trauma hasn't been studied at this point in 1978, the creation of PTSD as a label was actually in 1980. So this is 2 years before. This chapter talks about Bessel, his journey, the author and also the doctor, his journey into studying trauma, why it became important to him. So I wanted to start with a quote that is actually at the end of the chapter that I'll revisit. But trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Right, so the trauma, I think this is something we've got to be clear about. Trauma is not the event that traumatized you, right? A very big, intense, overwhelming, painful event creates trauma, because trauma, again, is the internal wound. It's how you took on the event, how you internalized it, how your brain structures, how your hormone, how your body, how your everything shifted after this overwhelming experience. And so again, trauma is an internal wound that has external consequences and external effects. And so getting into the chapter, so it starts, like I said, 1978. He's working at the Boston's Veteran Administration Clinic, so working with veterans. This man named Tom came in through the door, and he was really dysregulated, agitated, very clearly hungover, and he didn't know what he could do for him because he had never worked with somebody so agitated at the time. And he reported a lot of, so after sitting down with him and talking to him, he started to realize, okay, so he has like alcoholism, or he drinks to deal with something. It helps him to keep him calm. So he's like, okay, there's something going on. And he said Tom went through the motions of living a normal life, hoping that by faking it, he would learn to become his old self again. So before he went to the war, he was fine. He was like graduated high, like top of it. Yeah, valedictorian of his class, everything. He went to the army, and it was in the army that he experienced this overwhelming experience, as a lot of happens when you face a lot of combat, right? And he kept having nightmares and flashbacks. And so that's what was plaguing him. He felt both dead inside, but then had these very visceral responses to these memories. And he didn't know what was going on. So he was oscillating between being completely numb and being overcome with anger. And he was also having a lot of trouble sleeping. And so when the session came to the close, I love what Bessel says here. I did what doctors typically do. I focused on the one part of Tom's story that I thought I understood, his nightmares. As a medical student, he thought, okay, maybe if we work with his sleep, then he'll be good. So he gave him some sleeping medication and scheduled Tom for a follow-up for 2 weeks later. Tom comes back, And this is something that really struck me in this first chapter of the book, right? Which is, I realized that if I take the pills and the nightmares go away, he replied, I will have abandoned my friends and their deaths will have been in vain. I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. And that really stuck with me because this event, so whatever traumatized him in the war and they get into that experience, it has really impacted his ability to connect and fruitfully with the people who are presently in his life. But then he also has this guilt and reluctance to let go of this past or this experience or his attachment to the experience because it's the only way that all these people who have died will continue to live. And I think that's profound because I think a lot of us deal with that. Something that Ebony Davis once said was, I think the reason so many people have trouble like identifying with something outside of their trauma is because that they've built an identity around that. So when you tell them that it can shift, that you can heal your trauma, that you can be a different person, it feels almost like you're denying them that experience because of such an attachment to it. Because that's what gives it validity after all this time. And he goes into this like oscillating between wanting to be present but being trapped in the past because that's where you felt last. Because if you think about your present is dead and numb, but that's the last time I felt alive, I'm going to keep going back to the time I felt alive, you know? Even if it's a horrible experience, but it's better than this numbness, this nothing, this deadness I feel inside, right? So it kind of starts to make sense about how trauma moves like that. And as he talks about, unfortunately, all his psychiatric training had not prepared him for this. Like I said, it was in 1980 that they actually created the diagnosis of PTSD. Prior to that, it was called like traumatic neuroses, or there was shell shock, battle fatigue. There's all kinds of names to kind of talk about the effects of war on people. So because people come back and they seem disoriented, they seem like something shifted dramatically in them. They can't connect with other people, or they're violent, right? Or they're drinking a lot, or what's going on, right? But there wasn't a focused study for it, right? Let's see, what else? Let's go moving forward some more. Yeah, so he talks about a lot of other researchers, right? But someone was talking about Cardiner. Abraham, he's a psychiatrist in 1941. Abraham Cardiner said, sufferers from traumatic neuroses develop a chronic vigilance for and sensitivity to threat, right? The nucleus of the neurosis is a physioneurosis. In other words, post-traumatic stress isn't all in one's head as some people suppose, but has a physiological basis, right? The symptoms have their origin in the entire body's response to the original trauma. So that meaning that, right, the responses that we have when we are traumatized, these seemingly irrational responses, so either lashing out or punching a wall or any other thing that we're enacting unconsciously, it's not just in your head, right? It's in your body. Your body has taught you to respond in a particular way. Or these feelings fire off, and this is how we respond to these feelings now. You know what I'm saying? So, like for instance, this is just an example, if you were a big feeler and you would get beat by your parents for feeling big, anytime a big feeling comes, you're probably going to try to neutralize it, right? Toxic positivity. I'm fine. I'm actually fine. Nothing is even going on, right? Because you're trying to, it's not in your head that you can't feel your feelings, but you have been trained not to, right? The condition. And something I also love, a quote that has stuck with me, is we only had one real textbook, he said, our patients. We should trust only what we could learn from them and from our own experience. But also what the flip side that is challenging about that is human beings are experts in wishful thinking and obscuring the truth. I remember him saying the greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves, right? And that really also resonated with me, right? Because it's one thing to be sad, but what kind of suffering do we create when we say we're not sad? No, I'm fine. I'm good. Everything is okay. So much more suffering, right? And a lot of us are used to that. It's kind of how we were. I think that's how a lot of us were parented. Being good, right? Being fine, all that stuff. And then he moves into this really big part about trauma, right? So trauma in combat. So when he's talking about combat and talking about what soldiers have gone through, We don't really want to know what soldiers go through in combat, right? We don't really want to know how many children are being molested and abused in our own society, or how many couples, almost a third as it turns out, engage in violence at some point during their relationship. We want to think of families as safe havens in a heartless world, and of our country as populated by enlightened, civilized people. We prefer to believe that cruelty occurs only in faraway places like Darfur or the Congo. It is hard enough for observers to bear witness to pain. Is it any wonder, then, that the traumatized individuals themselves cannot tolerate remembering it, and that they often resort to using drugs, alcohol, or self-mutilation to block out their unbearable knowledge? Which brings a huge question, right? How do you respond to unspeakable things? Has anybody ever shared a really intense traumatic experience with you? How was your response to that? Right? Something that Brene Brown talks about, another author. Shame, in listening to people's shame, it sometimes brings us shame, which is what makes shame so hard to talk about. It's something we universally experience, but it's hard to talk about, right? Because it's feelings. I just watched this movie last night called Creep on Netflix. It's kind of ridiculous. It's a lot going on, but it's very interesting as a concept. But there's one point where he shares this really uncomfortable story about him enacting sexual violence on his wife. And I'm not going to get into all of it, but the guy who was listening to it was clearly very uncomfortable. And I remember listening and being like, ooh, that's deep, right? That's quite an experience you're talking about, sir. And I don't know. We say we want to connect with people. We say not everybody says they want people to feel heard or understood. I firmly believe that. But then also, do we have the capacity to listen to these terrible stories that people have, right? So the next part of the chapter, Trauma and Loss of Self, he then goes into Tom's story. I'm not going to get super into it. It's rather violent. He served in the Vietnam War. But even in reading and recounting what he's talking about, we have to deal with the reality of the destruction of war. He starts off with he talks about Tom had a friend named Alex that he made in the service, and everybody started feeling great, right? We're going to be prepared. We got all this training, excited to go travel new places. We're all strong and stuff. They made really close friends, right? Bonded with people in this really deep situation. And so now we get to the event that traumatized Tom. What happened was he was walking through a rice paddy just before sunset, and then there was a hail of gunfire, and then there was just explosions. So he was the only one who survived it after his whole platoon was destroyed. And he said one image he'll never get out of his mind, which was the back of Alex's head as he lay face down in the rice paddy, his feet up in the air. As Tom wept as he recalled he was the only real friend I ever had. Right? So that's already one part, right? That's one part of his trauma that's immense, to deal with the loss and the grief. Immense loss. Your entire team just blew up in front of you. And your best friend, the only friend you've ever had, is now lost, right? So he's dealing with that. And here's the part that was deep, right? Maybe even worse for Tom than the recurrent flashbacks of the ambush was the memory of what happened afterwards, right? I could easily imagine how Tom's rage about his friend's death had led to the calamity that followed. It took him months of dealing with his paralyzing shame before he could tell me about it. Since time immemorial, veterans like Achilles in Homer's Iliad have responded to the death of their comrades with unspeakable acts of revenge. I'm not going to get into what he did, but it was a lot of violence against children, women. He just went into a town nearby and went on a frenzy. And here, after that, it became truly impossible for him to go home again in any meaningful way. How can you face your sweetheart and tell her that you brutally raped a woman just like her, or watched your son take his first step when you're reminded of the child you murdered? Tom experienced the death of Alex as if part of himself had forever been destroyed. The part that was good and honorable and trustworthy. If Alex is really his only friend and he died, and it was the first time he really felt connected to somebody, it would make sense that he felt that with him dying was all his prospect for connection. Right? Because I don't know the trauma that Tom has had in his life prior to this moment. And later on, Tom ends up being one of the main people that he doesn't come back to him a lot, or he doesn't go further into his story so far from what I've read, and I'm up to part 5. But he does refer to Tom Malone because Tom is who revolutionized Bessel, the author's journey into studying trauma. It was through not being able to support Tom and learning more about Tom's experiences, studying the external consequences of these internal wounds he had, that he started to be like, trauma is really important, y'all. We need a way to categorize this and work with this. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? So, and in this part, trauma, whether it is the result of something done to you or something you have done yourself, almost always makes it difficult to engage in intimate relationships. After you have experienced something so unspeakable, how do you learn to trust yourself or anyone else again? Or conversely, how can you surrender to an intimate relationship after you have been brutally violated? Right? These are really, really, really big questions. And that's the thing, like, this is what I enjoy about this book, is he's taking a very fat topic and there's no easy solutions, right? Because war is, I want to say, abominable, right? It's horrible, the things that happen in war, that people are asked to commit, that the people who are receiving the war experience. It's just really, really, really traumatic for everybody involved. But then also, like we said, there's no one to talk about it with. Because who's Tom going to go talk to about this? He might be able to talk about the Alex dying part, maybe. But he can't even, because what happened afterwards, Because he felt so grieved, so bereaved, so sad and sorrowful and angry. He had this whole response, right? And now he's trapped in his own story. One of the hardest things for traumatized people is to confront their shame about the way they behave during a traumatic episode, whether it is objectively warranted or not, right? And yeah, that's a whole piece. And obviously, when we're dealing with this, all these feelings, what do I do? Who do I go to? I can't talk to anyone. So we go to what? Numbing. Right? It would make sense. If there's so much going on, you can't deal with present life because you're not actually here, and you can't deal with the past because you're not making sense of it. You're just trapped in your memories with flashbacks. Something he talks about a lot is like a traumatic event, the event that causes trauma, right? There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. There's an onset of it, the beginning of the thing. There's a middle part of it. Thank you. I appreciate that. There's this middle part of it where the thing was happening, and then there's the after of it. But when we're talking about a traumatic flashback, we're talking about a nightmare, there's no start, middle, or end, right? It's just happening. It's just happening. It can pick up at any point. It can start toward the end. It can start in the middle, and it goes on for however long. Hope you have a wonderful day as well. Thank you. Thanks for stopping by. Yeah, numbing as a way to cope actually ends up being like such a useful way to cope, right? Because instead of feeling these intense spikes of emotion, you're kind of just like at a level of numb, but then it makes you unable to connect with the people around you and have a meaningful life. You can't be present. It's hard to, or you feel, and I think the part that's even deeper is that you feel weird, right? If you can't feel things, and we're in a world that, first of all, the question is usually, how are you? That's the first question people ask you, whether or not they actually want to know, but that's our convention. So you can't identify how you feel, and you're dealing with, he got all this stuff behind him. I would numb too, So his form of numbing was a lot of drinking. He also he engaged in, high-risk behaviors like motorcycle riding and things like that. And he worked a lot. Whenever I think he was a lawyer, so whenever he was working on a case, he felt most purposeful. Yeah, the vibration, that spring he took out his Harley, the vibration, speed, and danger of that ride helped him pull himself back together to the point that he was able to leave his motel room and return to his family. He had to go out a lot, like spend time by himself, because he felt so, and this is the thing I think that's so heartbreaking about trauma, is that you feel like something's inherently wrong with you because you don't have a space to process, and your body doesn't even know how to begin to process all the things that are going on. And so, because you're dysregulated and you can't be with yourself, now trying to be with other people is impossible, right? Trying to connect with somebody else when you don't even understand what's going on with you, or you can't recognize what's going on in other people, massive, right? That impacts greatly your self-esteem. It impacts the connections you do have. and just makes it really hard all around to be a well-rounded human being. Like, because it's something that he's going to go back to over and over and over and over and over again, and something I'm coming to so much is we are social beings. We are born, you're not born alone. You're born already, there's two people, ideally, with you. And if not two, there's at least the one. And you learn from those people, right? You're going to learn from your caregivers. It's like how it works. So we are inherently social beings. And if trauma means broken connections, and it means that we can no longer connect to ourselves in a meaningful way, we can't connect to other people in a meaningful way, life is really hard, right? And so he talks about another person he met named Bill, who was also a veteran from Vietnam. And this story is fascinating because he comes in and he's just freaking out. I think he became a priest. And one day his wife went to work, and while he was at home, he was chilling. But the first day he was left alone with the baby, it began to cry, and he found himself suddenly flooded with unbearable images of dying children in Vietnam. He had to call his wife to take care of the kid, and he went straight to the VA to try to figure it out. He was like freaking out, right? Like he's seeing things, he's smelling things that are not here. So these are classic hallucination things, right? So all his colleagues, Bessel's colleagues, were like, that man is psychotic. Because the textbooks of the time said that auditory and visual hallucinations were symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. That's the only thing that they had defined, right? And this is something he also talks about a lot, and I think it's important to mention. The failures of the current medical structures we have. Medicine today is a hot-ass mess, right? It's not really even built to cure people. It's actually built to, there's a word I didn't know yesterday and learned, palliate, which is to alleviate without curing. A lot of the time we're dealing with symptoms. We're dealing with the top, but we're not dealing with the root. And he talks about some of the failures of things that have been defined incorrectly, and how, what is the word I want to say? Tremendous, how, not debilitating, what is it? Not tremendous, how deep the ramifications are, like how that then impacts the care that other people are able to get, right? If the doctor doesn't define you as having a problem, then you're not going to get no care, right? Or if they misdiagnose your problem and they give you a whole other thing, now you got a whole other problem to deal with. And so Bill, they thought he was psychotic because he was seeing these images of children's faces, of wounded children, but they weren't here, right? So everyone's like, what's going on? And eventually, after talking to him, Dr. Bessel had worked at a psychiatric ward before. Yeah, he had a previous job on a ward specializing in the treatment of schizophrenics, so he was intrigued and decided to sit with Bill further. And as he started talking about it, he said something that Sigmund Freud said about trauma in 1895. I think that this man is suffering from memories, right? And that's a beautiful way when we really think about trauma as an internal wound with external effects. This man is suffering from memories. So his memories were really plaguing him. And then here comes to this next part. He talks about the Rorschach Test. So a Rorschach Test, if anybody knows, it's like an Inkblot test, right? They show you this ink blot and you just say what you see of it. Because humans being meaning-making machines, when you see an ambiguous thing, like if you see a funky shadow, right, you make a thing of it. I see what I think I see that. So the first card, I think, is a black and white image. The second card is the first color image, and they started to notice that everyone had the same response when they ran. So something that is also a theme in this book is Dr. Bessel will notice something and then try to research it, because how do we study human resiliency? How do we study trauma when it's something that is so intimate and so private, and it affects us so differently, and if it's so quiet sometimes too? How do we study trends in that? How do we create treatments for people overall if everybody's having such a different experience? But yeah, they gave the test to 21 additional veterans, and the response was consistent. 16 of them, on seeing the second card, reacted as if they were experiencing a wartime trauma. And so when Bill saw it, he freaked out. He's like, that's the kid I saw blown up in Vietnam. You can see it all, and he's like describing it. 10 years after helplessly holding a dying baby in his arms, Bill was reliving the trauma in response to an ink blot. Right? You're right. While the majority of, and then this part was interesting, while the majority of veterans were greatly upset by what they saw, the reaction of the remaining 5 were even more alarming. They simply went blank. This is nothing, one observed, just a bunch of ink. They were right, of course, but the normal human response to ambiguous stimuli, like I said, when you see something you don't quite know it, you're going to put a name on it and try to figure it out. But for them, they were like, It's just ink. I don't know what you're talking about. And here he talks about, so the reason he brought up this whole Rorschach test is to talk about imagination. Imagination and trauma and how they are intrinsically tied, right? So traumatized people have a tendency to superimpose their trauma on everything around them and have trouble deciphering whatever is going on around them. There appear to be little in between. We also learned that trauma affects the imagination. The 5 men who saw nothing in the blots had lost the capacity to let their minds play. But so too had the other 16 men. For in viewing scenes from the past in those blots, they were not displaying the mental flexibility that is the hallmark of imagination. They simply kept replaying an old reel. So, and this was huge. I think this is a part that is often missed. If trauma impacts, again, we're going to keep saying this over and over. If trauma is an internal wound with external effects, one of the main external effects is broken connection and an inability to connect, right? And so if we can't connect with ourselves, we can't connect with other people, it's hard to connect with our imagination. How can you come up with a new solution? How can you stop experiencing what you're currently experiencing? How can you even think of something new if you can't? You know what I'm saying? And I think that's what's fascinating, that trauma impacts our imagination. Like he said, for some people where they can no longer imagine because their brain won't let them play. I done seen a lot. Listen, I'm not trying to see you no more. We cutting off this imagination right here, right? And then for the other side, not an imagination, but a triggering of the most violent memories you have. You're having the old reel, so it's not like you're imagining something new. You're actually just trapped in your memories. Imagination is absolutely crucial to the quality of our lives. Imagination gives us the opportunity to envision new possibilities. It is an essential launch pad for making our hopes come true. Without imagination, there is no hope, no chance to envision a better future, no place to go, no goal to reach. And it actually would make sense, too, when he talks in this first part of the book about trauma's effect on the collective, which is looking at our history and our culture. We live in a culture with a lot of history of lack of imagination. It's funny because we have a lot of great visionaries, right, who have led our society ahead. But if I ask somebody to not think about racism, what does the world look like without it? Suddenly we can't think about shit, right? Because we have been traumatized. It impacts our ability, our capacity to think. And we're coming up on the end of this part. What's this part now? Oh, this part was cool, very deep too. So when he started realizing that something's going on, right? Trauma is deeper than, it's not psychosis. It's not schizophrenia. It's not just, it's not just these wild emotions that we can't figure out. There's something going on because he's seeing a pattern between people. And while he was trying to get funding to do the research, he started to do group therapy. And in his group therapy, he started realizing there's this really beautiful connection that happens between traumatized people. So when he first started, this person, I don't want to talk about the war. That's how he just started. You reply, that's fine. You can talk about whatever. After half an hour of excruciating silence, so they didn't want to talk about the war, but we're here in a veteran circle. Of course we're going to talk about the war, but that's what I'm not going to push. We quiet. Suddenly somebody's like, okay, well, I got to talk about what happened to me. So he started talking about his experiences. Suddenly the whole group, he says, comes alive, right? They found resonance and meaning. Oh, whoa. This is the first time I'm talking about this thing again that we said before was unspeakable. And now I can talk about it with people and we can connect and this and that. And yeah, they felt a renewed sense of the comradeship that had been so vital to their war experience. They insisted that I had to be a part of their newfound unit and gave me a Marine captain's uniform for my birthday. In retrospect, that gesture revealed part of the problem. You were either in or out. You either belonged to the unit or you were nobody. After trauma, the world becomes sharply divided between those who know and those who don't. People who have not shared the traumatic experience cannot be trusted because they cannot understand it. Sadly, this often includes spouses, children, and coworkers, right? And that's the thing that I think is so heartbreaking about trauma, is that it really closes you off. Again, if it's broken connection, now it's closing you off because nobody could understand what I'm going through. I can't even understand what I'm going through. How can I talk about it with somebody else? It's all I think about, but I don't even know how to talk about it. Or I don't think about it, but something's bothering me and I don't know how to connect with other people. And this separation of in and out, you're either in it, you're either out of it. You either know or you don't know. that's real. And that, I think, is also how family generational secrets and curses get passed down, right? Is that we know as a unit, all them motherfuckers out there, they don't know about that. And they might judge, actually, right? And so we keep this secret, and it drives us further apart. And later on, the group, he led another group, and they gave him a watch, I believe. Because the whole idea was, and what I thought was fascinating about this part in particular was like, they didn't trust him at first because he was out of it, right? But he created the space for them to connect. So they're like, oh, so you must be kind of in it. But instead of, again, the imagination, the neuroplasticity, right? Your brain being able to adapt and shift and flow and understand new information. But instead of the brain being like, oh, this is a stranger now, that, oh, wow, so I can connect with people who haven't had my experience. Or I can connect with people who don't know exactly where I'm coming from. Instead, it became, I need you to come into my fold so I can understand why it is that I trust you. Oh, it's because we're together in this, because you get the trauma, right? And it's interesting. It's just so fascinating. And he ends this part with, whether the trauma had occurred 10 years in the past or more than 40, my patients could not bridge the gap between their wartime experiences and their current lives. Somehow the very event that caused them so much pain had also become the sole source of meaning. They felt fully alive only when they were revisiting their traumatic past. And it goes back to what Tom said about, I don't want to cure my nightmares because I have to be a living memorial for all the people who have died. My thing has to matter. I think it's our brain's way of trying to make sense of how much you've lost when you're dealing with trauma, right? Because again, trauma is not the event, but the internal wound from the event that imprints on the mind. And then we have these last section, diagnosing PTSD or post-traumatic stress. Like I said, so at this point now, they're trying to figure out what's going on. The multiple diagnoses. They had alcoholism, substance abuse, depression, mood disorder, even schizophrenia. They tried every treatment. The drugs that they were using on people were leaving them in a fog. They could barely function. When we encouraged them to talk about the precise details of a traumatic event, we often inadvertently triggered a full-blown flashback rather than helping them resolve the issue. Many of them dropped out of treatment because we were not only failing to help, but also sometimes making things worse. And I think what I love and appreciate about Bessel, Dr. Bessel, is that he's honest about when he's fucked up. Right? Which is like, they were trying to figure out how to help these people because, again, the medical structures, the current textbooks at the time were not providing the tools. So you're a doctor, this is your God, right? This is your guide, the textbook, this book that's supposed to help you diagnose people, but it doesn't have the people you're trying to work with in the book. What do we do, right? So he talks about a group of Vietnam veterans aided by some psychoanalysts in 1980, successfully lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to create PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which described a cluster of symptoms that were common to a greater or lesser extent to all of our veterans. Systematically identifying the symptoms and grouping them together into a disorder finally gave a name to the suffering of people who were overwhelmed by horror and helplessness. And this is where I go so back and forth with labels, right? It's important to have a label so that you know what the hell's going on. You got to be able to label this, identify it, name it, because then we can create solutions off of it. That's really important, because before they had that, they were not doing research about traumatic neuroses or the traumatic neuroses of war. They were kind of just, like you heard, misdiagnosing people all over the place. So then later on, you're going to get into what is the downsides of PTSD. And I mentioned it yesterday, right? PTSD is a very particular experience with nightmares and flashbacks. If you don't have nightmares and flashbacks, you can't necessarily qualify as PTSD, but you still have trauma. You know what I'm saying? So what ends up happening is he tries to submit Dr. Bessel tries to submit a grant application to have the VA, the Veterans Association, care about PTSD, right? They wanted to incorporate it into the way that they were dealing out their treatments. And apparently the opening line of the grant rejection said, it has never been shown that PTSD is relevant to the mission of the Veterans Association, which is crazy, which also shows you that I don't know, these things that are supposed to help. The Veterans Association is supposed to help veterans, but they don't even approve of PTSD after it has been declared and it has been lobbied for by veterans themselves. I don't know why. He didn't say, I don't think he knew why at the time. Now, of course, they're organized around PTSD and brain injury and all that stuff. But at the time, things were different. And he left. He handed in his resignation in 1982. And he decided to go instead to Massachusetts Mental Health Center, which is a teaching hospital, Harvard teaching hospital, where he trained to become a psychiatrist. There, he met a whole new group of people and encountered a whole new world of trauma. I'll just say, because it does come up later on in the book, he was struck by how many people he met that had stories of molestation or in family violence, especially about incest. This was puzzling, as the standard textbook of psychiatry at the time stated that incest was extremely rare in the United States. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I'm going to reach out to you after this. I appreciate you telling me that. This book, if you haven't read it, it might be very, very, very enlightening. This was puzzling, as the standard textbook of psychiatry at the time stated that incest was extremely rare in the United States, occurring about once in every 1,000,000 women. Given that there were only about 100 million women living in the United States, I wondered how 47, almost half of them, had found their way to my office in the basement of the hospital. Point being, he's reading a statistic talking about incest is very rare, right? It doesn't happen. And in fact, it says things like this. The textbook said, there is little agreement about the role of father-daughter incest as a source of serious subsequent psychopathology. It went on to say, such incestuous activity diminishes the subject's chance of psychosis and allows for a better adjustment to the external world. You hear what I'm saying? Like, the book is fucked up. I was going to not cuss. The book is fucked up. If you have a medical textbook saying that incest is rare, it's rare, and there's actually no subsequent consequences to this happening, and in fact, you might be better adjusted to the world, the book is fucked up. And how? So now, if you're a motivated doctor like Dr. Bessel, he wants to help these people, connect with them. What he's supposed to do with that? This is not right. The text is not right. I don't know what to do. And this is where it's beautiful that obviously his imagination was able to stretch. His neuroplasticity kicked in, Dr. Bessel. And the book is, again, his dedication to finding different ways to address these things. And then that's when he realized, wait a second, these folks who have experienced childhood trauma, sexual trauma, they have a lot of flashbacks, and they're kind of similar to these veterans. What's going on here? Is it not just a war thing? Is it not just the traumatic neuroses of war, or is there a different thing that's actually happening underneath? And the answer is yes, that it is trauma that's lying underneath, right? As we now know, war is not the only calamity that leaves humans in ruins. While about a quarter of soldiers who serve in war zones are expected to develop some serious post-traumatic problems, the majority of Americans experience a violent crime at some time during their lives, and more accurate reporting has revealed that 12 million women in the United States have been victims of rape. More than half of all rapes occur in girls below age 15. For many people, the war begins at home. Each year, about 3 million children in the United States are reported as victims of child abuse and neglect. 1 million of these cases are serious and credible enough to force local child protective services or the courts to take action. In other words, for every soldier who serves in a war zone abroad, there are 10 children who are endangered in their own homes. Right? And this is really intimate. There's a whole part, I think part 3 or 4, where he goes in on childhood trauma, right? Because now we're not dealing with enemy combatants. You're not dealing with, it's not hostiles, but your caregiver is your own source of terror. And here we are with the closing of the chapter. Like I said, this book is thick. We're going to get into it. Because if you're not going to read it, that's fine, but I want you to walk away knowing what the book is about, right? And I'll probably do a summary at the end, but we're going chapter by chapter. So here's the closing of this chapter, a new understanding. This is where I got that first quote from. It's essentially him summarizing, right? Ever since meeting Tom, a lot of things have shifted for him. A lot of things have shifted in the medical industry. But it's it's important that those things have shifted. So I'll reread that quote. Right. We have also begun to understand how overwhelming experiences affect our innermost sensations and our relationship to our physical reality, the core of who we are. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and body manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We have discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually it is not enough. Hi, DJs. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For any real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the processes by which to heal. So the next chapter, he's going to talk this first part is very brain heavy. So he's going to talk a lot about the structures of the brain that help us process trauma, or our brain before trauma, our brain post-trauma, and all of that stuff. But like I said, main takeaways for today's chapter is that trauma, and we're going to keep coming back to this, is an internal wound caused by an event, right, that has now external, long-lasting consequences. And it's important to learn about because it really moves so silently, right? Because a lot of trauma is unspeakable, we feel unable to talk about it. But if trauma has broken our connections to ourselves, because we can no longer deal with it on our own and we can't connect to other people, we're in a space of disconnection, right? We're lost. And that's where, I don't want to end on such a grim note. That's why this book is around. And really helping to repair. And this is why this book is so crucial. It is imperative that we reconnect to our body, right? And not only try to treat the external consequences, the behaviors, but to actually get curious about the underlying internal things that could be happening below the surface that drives the behaviors. And also that war is not the only thing that creates trauma, right? There's a lot of reasons that we can experience trauma. So thanks for tuning in today. Tomorrow, just to let you know, is Revolutions in Understanding Mind and Brain. So stay tuned. We'll continue reading. Have a great day, y'all.